I'll start again. Greetings, my name is Eli Fishbaum. I'm facilitator for the RAC seminar series. Tonight, Jared Lee will be discussing invasive species in general and more about local invasives, including Kudzu, its history, and some recent research on it. With a better understanding, we can better serve RAC's mission to protect our natural resources in the present and in the future. Before Jared's presentation, I want to inform you about future seminars like this one. Our programs are on the third Wednesdays of the month at 7 p.m. Up through May, they will be online as this one is, and register at rockbridgeconservation.org. Next month, Sarah Coffey will be describing her work with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation to negotiate agreements for grant recipients with waterfront property in our area to restore native riparian buffers. On April 19th, the framework for the Lexington Green Infrastructure Plan will be presented for discussion by Lexington Planning Commission member John Driscoll. March is unscheduled so far. In May, carbon pricing will be considered with presentations on two different approaches. Annette Green with CoreWorks initiative managed by Boxerwood sell carbon credits to finance projects that reduce carbon emissions or sequester carbon to offset consumer personal emissions. And we'll also be hearing from Clarence Edwards, a lobbyist for the Friends Committee on National Legislation, who will consider the benefits and potential for creating a federal carbon tax. Both these approaches seek to create incentives to reduce carbon emissions. On June 21st, our longest day of the year, we will be meeting in person at Jordan's Point Pavilion. Peter Del Vecchio, a local snake enthusiast, will describe the contributions of local snakes to our ecology and how to live with and protect them. He will be bringing some snakes to show us. I hope you can join us for these events. Jared Lee earned BS and MS of biology at Brigham Young University, and then went on to the University of Georgia to receive his PhD. His dissertation focuses on identifying invasive routes for invasive species, invasion routes, using genetic markers. The lab he worked in focused on a number of plant and animal species introduced between the United States and China, including kudzu, and if I spell this, privet, and mosquitofish. Jared has observed and collected invasive species throughout the United States, China, and the Philippines. Jared has said that he welcomes clarifying questions during his presentation, but we'll also have time following his presentation to ask questions. So feel free to jump in if you are interested. And I want to thank you, Jared, for your willingness to share with our community. We will know more following your presentation. And I will say that any opinions Jared may offer will be his and not necessarily that of RAC. Thank you, Jared. Take it away.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my desktop here and kind of fire up this presentation. So, all right. Well, thank you for the introduction, and I appreciate this opportunity to talk with members of the community about things that are of interest to you, and in particular things that we have in common as a scientist, and looking at especially things that affect our environment here. So I'm happy to. I'm gonna kind of talk. I'm gonna just do a little introduction about myself, kind of explain more of my background, and then really kind of just start diving into invasive species. Now, I'm going to put a lot of focus on kudzu because it's very prominent and very well known. But we're going to talk about a lot of others. You'll see examples of probably some other ones that some of them that you know are invasive here in this area, and some of them that may be native in this area but are invasive elsewhere. And we'll talk about a variety of issues here, and hopefully that'll open up some ideas. And I'm happy to address whatever questions you have towards the end. If you have questions or I'm not making sense as we're going along, don't hesitate to jump in, and just ask your question, and feel free to interrupt me, and I'd be happy to make sure everybody's kind of understanding you and following along. Now, just to let you know, what you're looking at here on this opening slide is, of course, a kudzu patch, and this is actually only half of the kudzu patch that I found. It's right here in Rockbridge County, just off of Forge Road, and it's actually on a private property. But I was able to contact the owner, and they were more than happy to let me come in and take a look and take pictures. And this is by far probably one of the most I'm going to use the word impressive, and I'm not trying to compliment this invasive species as if it's a good thing. But it's just the sheer size of it was just kind of overwhelming to me. I'm only showing you about half of it, and I had to actually, we actually went into the owner's house and went up on her second floor balcony and backed up as far as we can to actually kind of see everything all in one scope and try and take a picture of it. And anyways, the interesting story behind this kudzu patch is this kudzu patch was completely bulldozed in 2014. I mean, they just bulldozed the whole thing and just ripped everything out. But 4 years later, this is what it looks like when I came to visit. And the owner said that it's twice as big as what it was before it was bulldozed. And that's just 4 years. And in many ways, this is what exhibits a lot of things about invasive species that makes it frustrating to deal with, and also makes it very harmful for the environment, and also just annoys the people, because it can get into a person's property, and as you can see, it's just kind of taken over its own thing. So really that kind of addresses what we're dealing with here. Now, I want to take you back and kind of give you a little background on myself. And so we're going to start with a bullfrog. And I realize that it's a big jump going from kudzu to bullfrogs, but I promise it'll make sense here. When I was an undergraduate in college, this would probably have been back in 2004, and I was taking this zoology class. And at the end of the semester, we went on this wonderful field trip to southern Utah, and we spent our days visiting various habitats, high in elevation, low in elevation, and river washes, and we would just collect anything we could find. A lot of what we found, of course, were amphibians and reptiles. We also found a number of insects, and we looked at mammal life that was in the area. But in particular, our professor guided us to this pond where there was this population of bullfrogs. And he taught us, the method of capturing bullfrogs, and this was at night. We'd shine a flashlight in their eyes, and somebody else would come up behind it and just, grab it. And then we'd, put them in a container and hold them. And over the course of the few days we were there, we captured several of these bullfrogs. And our professor used this opportunity to tell us, these bullfrogs are actually invasive over in southern Utah. The American bullfrog is native here in the eastern United States. It has a broad distribution across much of the eastern United States, but it's been imported around the world for a variety of things, and it was imported into California, and it's since escaped out of the farms they kept them in, and established populations in the wild, and this was just one population at the area we were at. And so to kind of wrap up the story, our professor, who was from Tennessee himself, he was like, well, what we're going to do on the last day is we're actually going to sacrifice these bullfrogs, and then we're going to fry up their legs and eat them. You know, he had a recipe in a frying pan, and so it was a very kind of like a interdisciplinary lesson that we had, but it was fascinating just how profound of an effect it had on me, because it really kind of inspired me and got me thinking about invasive species and, you know, what they do into the environment. And so that kind of launched my interest as an undergraduate, and I kept that interest as I went into graduate school. And so it was no surprise as I entered my PhD program, I started working with a professor at the University of Georgia, and he specifically had a grant for looking at invasive species between the U.S. and China. The U.S. and China have long been trade partners, and they've shared not just, you know, economic resources, but along the way they've also shared a lot of biological resources, and that's one of the things that's led to a number of the invasive species that we have here in the United States. Many of them do come from East Asia. So right now, just I am currently a professor of biology at Southern Virginia University in Buena Vista, and that's where I live as well. Now, in my job, I teach a variety of subjects. I teach, for example, I teach a zoology class. I teach our general biology. I also teach anatomy and physiology. I don't have, every now and then I get the chance to teach about invasive species, either as part of a course, or sometimes I get to teach an entire course on invasive species. So getting to talk about this stuff is really fun for me, because it's a niche that I really enjoy and spend a lot of time on. As was mentioned, yeah, I did my dissertation on invasive species. Now, I didn't actually focus on plants. In my lab, we had individuals that were working on all of these species you see here. So in the upper left there, you might see a familiar species. Maybe it's growing in your backyard, but that's, you know, your typical pokeweed. It's native here in the United States, but actually it's been introduced to China, and it's established itself in China. And you can go over there and you can actually find, you know, populations of it there. To the right of that is a fish, which I'm aware is not a plant, but that's I work with freshwater fishes a little bit more in my past. But this species is called mosquitofish, and it was actually it's actually native here in the United States as well, but it's been introduced not just in East Asia, but in various parts around the world. And one of the reasons for that goes back to its common name. Its common name is mosquitofish, and it was believed to be the answer for controlling mosquito populations, and hence controlling various mosquito-borne diseases like yellow fever. And so in the early 20th century, it was moved around the globe throughout Europe, Asia, Australia, and it's even been spread down into South America and parts of Africa. Anyways, that's the species I focused on. Now, the other two species down here, of course, you recognize the kudzu down there in the corner, but the other one there represents Chinese privet. And this is another species that has been brought over from China. It's a common shrub. It's commonly used as a hedge, and you can, you know, cut it to a nice square shape, and it fits nicely. Very, very dark green leaves, and it's an evergreen, so you find it green year round. But it's ultimately it's from China. Now, let's see. So what it was like in the lab here was, you know, we're all work together. We all have this common interest in invasive species, but we have different questions we're asking with the different species that we're focusing on. And so one of the things that I got the opportunity to do is sometimes I would go out and I'd be like, hey, I'm going to this area of the country. I need to collect some mosquito fish there. And my friends in the lab would be like, oh, hey, if you see some kudzu out there, or if you see some pokeweed out there, or some privet, collect some samples for us. And so I went back and I was looking through some of my field notes, and there's several places in there where I found these wonderful places where not only was I able to collect these mosquito fish, but I was also able to find a kudzu patch and also either pokeweed or privet right nearby as well, and collect them as well. Now, right now in my position, I don't have any active research going on. Back in 2017, I taught a class on invasive species here, and I got my students involved in just going around and identifying all of the kudzu patches in Rockbridge County. And you probably are like, well, there's a lot of them, and there are. Unfortunately, the reason why we made it as a project is because they had not been documented. And towards the end of this presentation, I'm going to show you, where we document them, and open that up as a resource for you folks as well, because it's an open resource that anybody can contribute to. And since I started doing that, and I've made some connections, and I see a few familiar names here on the Zoom meeting. People have just been sending me every now and then emails of hey, so and so says there's a patch at this intersection and that. Do you want to go check it out? And I've been going and checking it out. I've been taking photos of them, and I've actually got a few more that I haven't been able to get to recently, just because I've been really busy. But it's been kind of fun just to keep on contributing to this interest of mine that has led to part of my career here. And so that really kind of gives you an idea of some of my background. Now, they explained that one of the things I study is invasion routes, and to explain that, one of the ways that we want to help prevent invasive species is by trying to determine how they were introduced in the first place. And there's sometimes records that are or how they're recorded, but as a scientist, one of the things we look for is some very objective things, because sometimes records are incomplete. Sometimes records are not kept, especially with a lot of invasive species that are just kind of accidental. But DNA doesn't lie. And so when we can look at various markers on the DNA, it's not very different from like a crime scene investigation that you see on TV, where we look at the DNA in the invasive range and we compare it with a sample from the native range, and that gives us an idea as to maybe where in the native range they came from specifically, and maybe also how many different places from the native range, because sometimes they're being pulled from multiple different places. So for example, like one thing I can tell you about my mosquito fish right here, the mosquito fish that I sampled throughout Asia, and when I say throughout Asia, I mean all throughout China, parts of Japan, the Philippines, okay, all the populations. I can definitively say with about 98 to 99% certainty, all those fish ultimately can be traced back to one locality just outside Galveston, Texas. And that's the power of this, is that's where they came from. And so it was kind of this single introduction, and I could spend a lot more time talking about that, and if we have some time, maybe I can explain some more later on. But I want to get to this invasive species. So I want to talk about kudzu a little bit, kind of where we're at right now. Now, what you're looking at here is a map that generally kind of describes where kudzu is located at, and the degree to which it is kind of invaded. So the darker green means there's more and more kudzu patches, a higher concentration, and this is kind of broken down by counties throughout the southeast United States. And so you can kind of see that that Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia is where it's most densely, but it is really spread throughout all of the southeast. And you look up there in in West Virginia, there's also a lot of really dense populations. And, if you've driven through West Virginia, you've probably seen, some significant kudzu patches there. I remember my advisor telling me he was going through West Virginia one time and he found just this really massive kudzu patch that he wasn't sure where it began or where it ended, but it was just, and the way he described it was just incredible. So as you can see, this is something that's established throughout much of the southeastern United States. Now it's commonly moved around and used as a ground cover to prevent erosion, and that's one of the reasons it was originally brought here. How well it does that, I'm not sure, but that's one of the reasons why it's constantly planted. And one of the things we see is that, and this is the bullet point down at the end, it's often found at roadsides. And so when roads are put in, sometimes the Department of Transportation will intentionally plant kudzu on these roadsides to prevent erosion and to hold some of these banks. And this is a great example right here in Rockbridge County. If you're familiar with Route 60 that goes between the Brewledge Parkway and all the way through Lexington, there's several kudzu patches along the way there. And many of them right there at the roadsides, many of them are on steep embankments. Those were originally planted, by the Department of Transportation. They were put in there, but you can also find that it also, escapes and it establishes itself in other places. It's known to establish very, very large, very dense patches, and these can climb trees and form those, typical vines. It's just fast-growing vine. At its peak, it's known to grow by at least a foot a day at kind of its peak growing season. So it can really just take over, and it can expand in all directions if it's not controlled. Now, this fourth bullet point that I've got here is something unique that we've observed that I think is important because it might help us if we think about controlling it. First of all, its growth begins really late. It's not going to be the first plant that comes out in early spring. Usually, you don't start seeing the vines putting out leaves until April or into early May. But all of a sudden it's like you hit late May and into June, and all of a sudden these vines just have these massive leaves and it's just growing like crazy. And so there's kind of this period of early spring where the kudzu vines are dead and you can see the other plant species underneath them trying to get a start. But then when June comes along, they're gone and the kudzu is just taken over and it's swamped over them. Now, whether the plants underneath the kudzu are native or invasive, I don't know, but the other thing is that I'm getting a feedback. Okay. But they persist late in the season, and so it's very possible going all the way back to into November, you still see live kudzu out there. And that can actually be helpful if you're thinking about controlling it, because by the time, late October, November comes around, a lot of your other plant species have started to decline, leaves are gone, and it might be a little bit easier to identify those vines and go in and cut them and remove them. They might not be as healthy as they are like in their peak, which is like kind of August and September. But that's one of the things that we've noticed about kudzu is that it's kind of this late bloomer in the spring, but it does persist a little bit later into the autumn and into some of the colder weather. If you've spent time with kudzu, and I don't know if you have, but you might have found flowers. And it's if you take the flower of a kudzu and you smell it, it smells like grape. Okay, and this vine is related to your typical grapevine. And I'll blatantly admit that I'm not the greatest botanist, and there have been times where I've mistaken grape for kudzu. And I'd go out and I'd collect these grape plants and take them back to the lab, and my lab mates would be like, "Yeah, good job, you collected some grape plant for us, Jared." Anyways, so that's kind of the status of kudzu here. And so what I want to do is, I want to talk about just kind of invasive species in general here, and look at, some of these just fundamental questions. Now, some of this stuff you might be familiar with, and other stuff, maybe I can, expand upon here. But generally, like, what is an invasive species? And there's some definitions here. This is a definition that I like. We describe it as kind of a species that establishes populations outside of its native range, usually due to human introductions, and causes ecological and or economic harm. Okay. Now that definition is really important because it really includes a lot of different elements. First of all, species do move. Okay, species do move. They have various ways they migrate and transport themselves, and so adding this due to human introductions, this human association, I think is really important, because most of the invasive species that we're worried about right now, they can be tied back to human introductions within the last couple hundred years. Okay. Establishing a population is also important. Many of you might be gardeners, and that's great. One of the things that we have to recognize is that with gardening, what we're trying to do is we are trying to grow something, whether it be a flower, whether it be a crop, for our benefit. And a lot of times we're trying to control that so that we can harvest it. Okay. Now, and so just because we plant something in our garden doesn't make it invasive. Okay. It needs to establish some kind of population in the wild. And then, of course, causing ecological and or economic harm. And this is something that scientists can spend a lot of time debating about and doing research on, because sometimes something gets introduced, but we really don't detect any kind of like harm. And so sometimes you'll see scientists use different words. Sometimes you'll say this species is introduced as opposed to being invasive. And usually if they're saying invasive, that means maybe they have some indication that there's some kind of negative impact. Whereas if they just use introduced, they're acknowledging that it is not native to this area, but it doesn't seem to be causing like serious harm or problems. Okay. And then the other thing, you've got just the association with humans and human transportation. And so most of the invasive species we think of are associated with human movement and transportation. Okay. Now the pictures that I got examples of here, of course, you got your Japanese knotweed up there. And then I got two animal species. You've got your zebra mussels. And of course, in the lower right-hand corner, excuse me, that is your brown tree snake. Now the zebra mussel, that is something that was introduced in ballast water. As ships would move, they take up ballast water and then they go to their destination and they release the ballast water. It turns out that the larvae of these mussels are these free swimming, microscopic individuals that get caught up in this ballast water, and then they get transported around the world. And then they can establish themselves and grow into adults. And I'll talk more about zebra mussels as I go along here. Now, the brown tree snake, this is also a fascinating story. The brown tree snake is native to Australia, but in the 1960s, it was discovered on the island of Guam, and their best guess is that this species was transported with like a lot of the cargo and the ships left over from World War II as the U.S. was bringing all of its equipment and troops home. Guam was a base there, and we still have military personnel there. Excuse me. Now, the harm that these two species have done is actually quite tremendous. Zebra mussels are known to get into like pipes and around piping and
Bernie, over
clog
here.
them up. And then the brown tree snake, because it's a tree snake, it climbs up in trees. And throughout much of the 70s and 80s, they documented the decline of the native bird species in Guam. And they've lost a lot of the native bird species because of this one introduced species. And there's a lot of research going into trying to control them and restore some habitat. One of the other risks, though, is making sure that the brown tree snake doesn't continue its invasion, because there's a lot of flights as well from Guam to other islands in the South Pacific, particularly Hawaii, and they don't want the brown tree snake to get into those areas. And so there's a lot of efforts to prevent that from happening. Okay. Now, let me take you to the top, I guess, the top 100. What you're looking at here is what is known as 100 of the world's worst invasive species. And what this was put together by some researchers, and they've broken it down into a lot of the different taxonomic groups. And you can probably see that, you know, there's a lot of your, you know, a lot of the, you know, well-known species there. If you look over here with the land plants, of course you see kudzu on there. Here's privet. You see others. I think Japanese knotweed is on there, and others that are known throughout the world. They don't necessarily have to be introduced into the United States, but just around the world. You look at other animal species, and you see there's a variety of things. This is a fungus, and so this is one aspect of invasion biology that gets kind of interesting. Is we even consider microorganisms. Up here you see these different viruses. Okay, we consider them invasive species, where they are causing disease in other plants or animals. And, you know, in some sense, you could consider any kind of like disease as some kind of an invasive species. That's a really, really broad definition, but there's a lot of other species on here, some of which I'll talk about. You know, there's your Argentine ants, your fire red ants. Over here, there's the brown tree snake for your reptiles. Under the bird, you see your starlings. This is my species, the western mosquitofish. This is the species I studied for my dissertation. On this list, you're probably wondering, well, what criteria do they use? And it says right down here in the corner, the species that were selected for the list use two criteria. There's serious impact on biological diversity. Okay, so these are some of the worst offenders where we're seeing them outcompete other species or prey upon other species. And the other thing is an illustration of important issues of biological invasions. And so a lot of times we look at this list of 100 worst invasive species as kind of, you know, just one way of advertising and talking about invasive species. But you'll notice they put here in bold down here, they say absence from the list does not imply that a species poses a lesser threat. And that's a very important point that they make here. Just because, you know, a species that maybe is a problem in your area isn't on this list doesn't mean that it's any less of a problem. It's a very serious problem, and probably should, you know, be looked at with the same kind of seriousness. But I wanted to show you this. This list is out there, and I think there's been very little change in this list over the years. This was originally published, I think, in 2003 or 2004. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about plants, because plants, they actually have they're kind of overrepresented as invasive species. Why is that? Well, if we look at just some of the basic biology of plants, it makes sense. So for example, They do not need an entire individual to establish itself. Okay, and so if you're a plant person, you understand. You just need seeds. You need pollen. You just need cuttings, even in some cases. And there's rhizomes. There's all kinds of structures that plants have that it can grow more of itself from, that you don't need to take an entire plant. Okay. Now, on top of that is that second bullet point, the ability to hitchhike on other organisms. And so that pollen, those seeds, they can attach themselves to the fur of mammals or the legs of a bird, and they can get moved around. Now that's very natural transport. But if we think about it from the perspective of a human, right? These things can easily get caught into the clothing, okay, or they can get caught in packages. So, for example, one species that has been introduced to Asia is it's called Japanese stilt grass, and this Japanese stilt grass was in the early 20th century. It was originally used in packaging materials. So it was the grass that was wrapped around like fragile goods, whether it be china or vases or something like that. And then they unpack it here in the United States and they discard this Japanese stilt grass. And most of the leaves and the stems were dead, but there was seeds on them. There was pollen. And so that hitchhiking allows them to attach. They can also attach to soil. If there's dirt samples that are taken, or if somebody's bringing another plant in, it's not bringing just that plant, but it's also bringing in anything that's caught up in that soil or other debris. The other thing is that what those structures do is that it allows for these plants to wait for the right conditions, and wait for it to warm up, wait till there's plenty of moisture, and then they can start growing. And the other thing is that plants have a tremendous ability just to reproduce in large numbers, and so they can produce lots of offspring, and that just makes them very well set up for being invaders. And that's why a lot of invasive species are plants, easily moved around, easily established. Of course, the two pictures I'm showing you here, you've got goldenrod there in the corner, which is native here in the United States, but again, it's invasive elsewhere, China in particular. And then Bradford pear, where it's and this is a species that I've seen arguments going back and forth about whether it's truly an invasive or it's just introduced. It's actively planted, and it forms these nice trees and have these nice colorations with its flowers and that in the springtime. But it's not native. But that's just an example of why plants are. And again, we think about all the different plants that we have in the area that are probably not native to the area. Very, very easy for them to move around. When we talk about how they're introduced, and I've shared a little bit about this, but there's two main categories, and they fall under that of accidental and intentional. Okay, so accidental was just something that happened with like the zebra mussel. And I've got a picture there of a boat that is emptying out its ballast water after its journey. Okay, not only did it take in that water, but any of the organisms that are in that water, and it held them, and now it's spitting them out. And a lot of times these would be brought into the rivers, upstream, into freshwater areas. And nowadays there's some more regulation of ballast water. You can treat ballast water. They also have regulations about when to let ballast water out, because if you let the ballast water out deeper in the ocean, it minimizes the risk to freshwater waterways. Those would be accidental, where there's they came along as hitchhikers and actually got to where they were going. Then you have intentional introductions. This is where the human factor comes in, because humans are like, I want to take this species from here and I want to introduce it here. And what I'm showing you there is Chinese wisteria, which has these beautiful purple flowers that come out in the springtime, and they're just like, you know, this, it's just this very like beautiful garden-like feel, just dangling. You kind of want to go and stand under this wisteria and just get lost and meditate in that. It's just really, really aesthetic feeling. But again, people see that and they're like, oh, I want to take that home with me. Okay. And for those of you that are into horticulture, this is what we do. You know, we see this really, really beautiful flower, or we see this wonderful plant, and we're like, oh, I'm going to take this. We take a cutting, we take seeds, right? And we transport it back. And so there's these intentional introductions that occur. Other intentional introductions, you know, are kind of follow along the lines of what happened with kudzu, which I've kind of outlined here. So in the late 1800s, it was typically introduced as like an ornamental. It's a vine and it grows fast. And so people initially introduced it because they like having vines in their landscaping, whether it's crawling up the side of a wall or just spreading out around the base of their home. You know, it was introduced initially as an ornamental. In the early 20th century, it came back in popularity, mostly for erosion control, realizing that they could spread it around and it would, you know, keep that soil in place, especially on disturbed areas, roadsides in particular. And it became so popular that in the 1930s, the Soil Conservation Service actually established nurseries of kudzu across several states. You'll notice Virginia is one of them. Okay, Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama. You'll notice those are some of the states that are hardest hit as far as, you know, established kudzu populations. And so this was a very active program of planting kudzu and, you know, putting them in places where they thought it was going to help them. Now, I'm not saying that kudzu doesn't stop soil erosion. I think it can be very good for preventing the erosion of soil. The question is it the best thing, and is there a native species that we could use instead? And sometimes that's what you see with intentional introductions, is that we select one just because it's clear and it's obvious and, you know, it's easy to move. But if we did a little more thought, if we did a little more work, could we find something that's more native, more better adapted for that environment, that could do just as good a job? And so because of that, you know, that's why we see kudzu distributed so widely throughout the Southeast United States. It was very much an intentional introduction, and it was established by humans just for that purpose. Okay, now I'm going to ask this next question here, and this might seem a little bit odd, but how are invasive species invasive? In other words, what makes them like invasive? What bothers them? Well, it really boils down to this idea of when you compare the native with the invasive populations, how are they different? And here are three things that I've seen and that we've noticed that are in the literature, very well documented. First of all, increased population growth. A lot of times in the invasive population range, we see the populations grow a lot faster as far as numbers, reproduce quicker, okay? And then aggressive range expansion. And this is where we actually kind of see kind of in a time lapse. If we look at where are we finding the species over like, you know, 5 or 10 year increments, and we see this expansion of the species. Now, there's one of the species in the top right corner, that's cheatgrass, which is a well-known invasive throughout the Midwest, the Western United States. Down in the right-hand corner, you're looking at the fire ant, the red fire ants. They have some very aggressive range expansion, moving. Another thing we also see are larger individuals, and this is where I want to talk about goldenrod a little bit. American goldenrod, very beautiful plant, okay, and just really, really just bright flowers. One of the things we found when we were doing some talking with some of our colleagues over in China is that the goldenrod they would see was so much larger. They took us in, they showed us one specimen of this goldenrod plant that was just, 12, 15 feet in length, much larger than we would see in the States in its native range. And interestingly enough, that's also what we see with kudzu. Here in the United States, we're used to seeing these massive kudzu patches, massive kudzu patches. But when we go to China and we okay, where's your kudzu? And they show us the kudzu, it could hardly be called a patch. You can still see the vine and it's still climbing up, but it doesn't form this, dominant patch that just covers acre after acre. It's really just, kind of this vine that you see weaving in among a lot of the rest of the plants, and the other plants are growing and thriving amongst it. And so the patch in China is much more smaller, much more diminutive, and not as big of a problem. And so we see this huge difference between these native and invasive species when we compare them and how their populations behave. A little bit about, and this is getting a little bit technical, but I wanted to introduce it a little bit because this came out of the lab. I didn't do this, but my friend, my advisor and a fellow grad student did this work, and it plays a role here. Kudzu has both sexual reproduction and it can also just clone itself. And in the native range, we see kind of this mixture of both of that. But as they looked at these kudzu patches here in the United States, they found, and again, this is where we use the genetics, right? We're sampling its DNA and we're comparing it. And what we're finding is that within this invasive range, it's relying on clonal reproduction more than sexual reproduction, which means that there's not a lot of what we call genetic diversity among them. Now, I threw in a couple figures from their paper. Right here on the right, you see kind of a map of the Southeast United States, and each of these dots represents a population that they sampled. And you'll notice the color coding. Some of them have these pie charts with multiple colors. Those are rare, okay? That means they have multiple different kind of lineages in them. But all these other ones, especially ones that are black, they're all just the same. So in other words, this black is the same as this black. And this black all the way up here in the, northern west corner of Missouri is the same as this black down here in Florida. It's the exact same, and they're basically clones of each other. And so what that means is this lineage has just propagated itself throughout the Southeast, and you'll see it just spread all over the place. This graph here, this graph here also kind of shows that. Down here it's saying if you look at the number of clones in the population, you'll see that there's just one or two in most of them. And over half of the lineages in any one population, they're the same. And so what that means is when we walk into a kudzu patch, probably most of those vines, as you go from one end to the other, most of them are just clones of one another. And that's a very interesting behavior that we don't see in the native range as well. And something that's kind of, very specific here to our kudzu species here that we're so familiar with. Now, I don't think I need to spend a lot of time talking about why invasive species are bad. And I just kind of put three big things on there. One is just ecological harm. And here, this is where we look at it out-competing native species or preying upon native species to the point that we see the decline in these native populations. There's also economic harm. There's a number of studies that look at, what is the cost of invasive species, and they estimate different things about, how much are government budgets being spent on controlling or cleaning up after invasive species. So if we go back to that zebra mussel and you think about, if those zebra mussels get inside of pipes, they can grow and grow and grow and clog these pipes. Well, what you got to do is you got to go and you got to clean all that out, and you got to scrape all that out. And of course, you know, that's a cost. Okay. And there's some interesting estimates that are just astronomical, like in the hundreds of millions of dollars per year, just trying to control and you know, get rid of invasive species. The other thing is they're just generally a pest. They can be considered pests or an annoyance for people, you know, and that's where kudzu comes in, because again, going back to that story at the very beginning of, you know, that, you know, private property here in Rockbridge County where there's just this massive kudzu patch. I think the owner was willing to let me, I think she just wanted me to do anything to get rid of it. And I wish I had some kind of like, you know, magic, technique just to get rid of it. But I mean, the fact of the matter is kudzu, it's not easy to do. It varies depending on, you know, I mean, a lot of these invasive species, sometimes we can isolate, you know, both ecological harm or economic harm, and in some cases, there's research that can pinpoint specific ecological things. Sometimes it's inferred or it's extrapolated, and a lot of times with the economic harm, we can identify like direct costs, but then there's also indirect costs that sometimes we just have to estimate. And so sometimes there's not like good hard data on these, but it's very clear that they do quite a bit of harm that we really wish we could get rid of. Okay, so this is probably an area that, you know, many of you maybe have some experience with, or wonder about, how do we stop and control this invasive species? Well, at the top of my list, of course, is prevention. Okay, if we can prevent invasive species from moving around, that helps us out tremendously. And you know, the image that I've got there at the top of this lady washing off her boat. This is one of the ways that we help prevent zebra mussels and other mussels from moving, because what happens is you know, a person that goes boating, you know, they're going fishing, they'll go into one lake and they'll be there for a few hours, and then sometimes, you know, they'll go out and they might try and do fishing in another lake or stream. Well, if they don't wash the boat in between, then there's the potential for again, larvae of these mussels to actually attach to the hull of the boats, and you know, in the small amount of water that's still remaining on there, just kind of live there, and then it gets to another lake and it can establish itself. But something as simple as just taking a quick pressure washer to the boat and rinsing off the boat right there in the area before you leave, you actually can remove a lot of organisms that potentially could attach itself and prevent those introductions from continuing, and that can help stop the spread. The removal of non-native species is always desirable, and I think that's one thing that we try to do. Unfortunately, it's a challenge to go into any kind of habitat and just remove all of a single species. With kudzu, you know, a lot of times those vines are just entangled with a lot of other plants, and so you're also damaging the other plants underneath it. But then, of course, you know, there's also the roots, and getting all the roots and other like plant debris that could potentially give rise to, you know, another generation the next year. And again, that story I began with, okay, they bulldozed it, and 4 years later, it was twice as big. And so that can be really challenging. So another thing that people do is try to control the expansion. And a lot of times through that's usually used in manual means. And so what you're seeing there in the image, of course, is somebody that's actually mowing kudzu, which is actually something that's proven to be quite effective in controlling kudzu, is just going in and just mowing it back. For those of you that are familiar with with Route 60. You know that right there at the beginning of Buena Vista, at the top of the hill where Food Lion is, there's several kudzu patches there. And when I first got here in 2016, 2017, that kudzu patch was really out of control, and there was a lot of overgrowth that was actually spilling onto the road. But what's more important is that kudzu, it was actually blocking the ditch, the drainage ditch right there at the bottom. However, one thing that's happened, and I don't know who did this. If you know who did this, then by all means, go ahead and thank them for me. But it's probably the city, but they started cutting that back, and they started cutting back the kudzu and clearing out the ditch so that the water could drain properly off of the road and down the hill. And ever since they started doing that, it's really helped out that area. I haven't seen that kudzu patch expand very much, and of course, it hasn't gotten into the road. But sometimes that's the best we can do with some of these species that are just so well established, is just contain and control and prevent them from going in. The other thing that I like to talk about is just promoting native plants. When we go into like, you know, developing an area, I always encourage people to, you know, find native plants and plant them. Find native trees, plant those in your yard. You know, look at native shrubs. Those are ones that are going to be well adapted to the environment. So for like the temperature, the moisture, and all that, and that is going to help out so much, because it kind of makes your home, it makes your home an area where not just native plant species, but also native insects and birds, and that will also be able to thrive. That can help out with the biodiversity. And then, of course, you know, the other thing that I'm also is just education and raising awareness. Some people just don't know a whole lot about invasive species, and they can, you know, learn a lot. And something like this, I enjoy doing, because I think it helps gets discussions going. It gets good information out there for other people to use. Now, what I'm showing you here, this is the EdMaps website, and this is the website that I was telling you a little bit about earlier on. This is a website that strives to document where invasive species are located. You can go on, you can create a free account, and you can report sightings. You can also look up your favorite invasive species and see where it's distributed in your area. And if you see if you know of a population that's not documented, you can go in and you can add it. Really, all it does is you documenting like the location, and that could include roads, it could include GPS, taking a picture of the plant, because that's important, because what they do is they forward these pictures to experts who are like, okay, yeah, that's kudzu, or yeah, that's privet, okay. And that way you can go in and document that. And so you can go to this website. I put the website down there. This website is maintained by the University of Georgia. There's a invasive species group there that maintains this. And if you go and look in Rockbridge County, and you look at the kudzu sightings, all those kudzu points on there, I put those in. And if you've got more information, I'd be happy to help you put that in, or you can, if you can figure it out, you're welcome to do that. But this is a great way to do some citizen science and contribute to just documenting where things are at and how bad they are, and it provides information that species that researchers can use and help us record and track other invasive species. Okay, that's about all I've got for now. And I've been talking for quite a while here. So I'd love it if you guys had some questions. We could talk about, you know, whatever you want, and hopefully what I had to say made sense. But what questions do you have? What can I answer, or at least attempt to answer?
That was a great presentation. It held my attention the whole time. I have a number of questions, but I'm only the last one, so I can share you with the rest of the people. But how does soil, particularly with kudzu, and also I really like the idea of citizen science supplementing your data by reporting our patches. If that's helpful, then I think we should encourage our constituents to do that. But I was interested in soil as an issue. Like you showed that that lot that the guy bulldozed, and you saw where the patch was really thick, but right next to it looked like it was subsoil. And I was wondering how much the quality of the soil affects the invasive nature of that species. Like, for example, is soil like a bacterial dominated soil or a fungal dominated soil? I mean, and where it would fit in the succession, that plant in its natural setting, where in the succession. Does that make any sense?
No, that makes sense. And I don't think I have a good answer. I don't know much about the soil bacteria or the fungal bacteria and how it interacts with invasive species. From my understanding, most of the function of the soil and the fungus is to provide nutrients for the plant, and the plant might not be any the wiser, or the bacteria and the fungus might not be any the wiser whether it's a native or an invasive species. They might just recognize that roots, and so they might not be able to discriminate at that level between native and invasives. The composition of what bacteria, what fungus, that's an interesting. I've never looked at that angle before, but there might be something there that can differentiate. Yeah.
So I'm a follower of Elaine Ingham, and who's a scientist that developed the soil food web concept. In any case, certain plants, like we commonly associate with weeds in the garden, for example, are bacterially dominant, and some plants are fed by fungal, and if there's a fungal, like a fungal hyphae, gathering nutrients to feed those plants, they will do better than the other kind that don't get fed by the fungal. So that's something to look at. So others want to ask a question?
So there's a question in the chat by Susan Bradford. She asked, would it be easier to control kudzu in the wintertime when it is dormant? I think that's a great time, because a lot of times when that kudzu is dormant, you can still see the vines, but you don't have to go through all the leaves and the brush there. And so that might be a good time if you're doing some manual control, going in the wintertime, pulling up those vines, cutting those vines, trying to follow them back and remove them. That might be an ideal time for removal, to slow that down, because if you just leave them in place, yeah, I mean those vines will just regenerate and they'll already be set. But if you're cutting them, then it has to regrow, and you can control it a little better. So the wintertime will be great if it's really clear where those vines are. And it's the unfortunate thing is with that, it's very much a manually intensive way of introducing of controlling the kudzu.
I'll ask another question.
Wait, Richard here has a question.
Okay, good.
Yeah, hey, how you doing? Thanks for your presentation. I have a house down along River Road, which is State Route 663, south of Buena Vista off of 501. And over the last several years, I've noticed the spread of stiltgrass along that area. And one thing that seemed to really accelerate that was a practice the highway department has done recently, where they come in with a machine that has a sort of a lawn mower, a rotary mower on an arm, and they just cut all of the small brush back along the embankment down River Road. And before that happened in the summertime, people would go up and down the road to pick wineberries and other native, flat fruit and stuff that would grow out of the weeds. That all got wiped out, and it's almost entirely stilt grass now. And it seems to me that the highway department's not aware that they're just destroying sort of a local environment, and they're allowing this invasive species to just take over this disturbed soil. I mean, it's really striking. The thing about stiltgrass is a lot of people in the county don't even know about it. I'll ask landowners in other parts of the county, I said, have you guys got stiltgrass? And they'll say, what's that? And you can find it all through the national forest on trails, logging trails, disturbed soil. It's really, once it gets going, it's pretty bad. I'm not saying, there's so much of the invasive species that is related to what man does.
Yeah. And you bring up also a good point that I didn't talk about, and that is we always also associate invasive species with disturbed habitats. Okay. When habitats are disturbed and a lot of the native species are just removed, you think of like building roads, house development of any kind, that creates kind of this barren soil that invasive species tend to colonize. And so when you go to disturbed habitats, you tend to find more invasive species, as opposed to when you get into more natural or less disturbed areas where you don't find as many invasive species.
Jared, that brings up that point about the soil. When you have disturbed area, you're disruptive of the fungal hyphae, the mycorrhizal fungal that would lend itself to the kind of plants that aren't fed by that. And so I'm not a scientist like you are, but I'm suspicious that is a factor in why the disturbing the soil creates a favorable environment for some kinds of plants.
Thank you. So somebody asked a question if I could share a picture, and so let me just share a picture here real fast of kudzu up close, so you can kind of see what it's looking like to have you look at it. This right here is a classic kudzu leaf. One of the things you typically see are these three lobes, like this. Those three lobes. That's one of the features. And then usually looking right here at the end of the stem, you see three leaves coming off of it. You see three leaves and you see three lobes. Now that's not to be confused, of course, with your poison ivy, which also has parts of threes. But you see these are viney, and you'll also see a lot of trichomes along the stems or the vines. They're not prickly, they're not sharp, but they do have a fair amount of trichomes that are there. And they're really dense and distinguishable, but that's really kind of what those look like. So somebody else asked a question here saying, are there any biological control strategies for kudzu? Let's see, about 10 years ago, in Georgia, they actually found a beetle that was supposed that they named the kudzu beetle. It was also from East Asia, and it seemed to feed upon kudzu. I don't know if they've done any more research or if there's any more evidence that it only feeds on kudzu. That's a potential biocontrol. I have very mixed feelings about biocontrol in general. And just to clarify, biocontrol is a strategy where you introduce another species to control the invasive species. And from a moral standpoint, it doesn't make sense to introduce yet another species to control what you already introduced. And there's lots of stories of biocontrol species that have gone wrong. But there is that kudzu bug. I haven't seen any recent research on it. obviously, I think if it really was going to have a huge impact, we would have seen some more. But it's possible there's something there. Also, another question was brought up about goats. I had a student whose father actually works for Purdue University, and he's a research scientist out there, and he also works with invasive species. And we got to talking. He came out to visit, and we were talking, and he actually said that they've been using goats experimentally and having good success with goats. And so, I mean, goats are well known just to eat whatever vegetation they can, and that might be another strategy is having goats to control. I don't know how you would control the goats to just eat the kudzu. Obviously, you've got a big kudzu patch, just letting the goats loose. That might help, but goats is something that people are looking at as far as something to control. In a kind of controlled manner there. Okay, I'm looking at another question here that someone posted. Is there any service in this area that will tackle kudzu on residential small wooded area? I don't know if there's any service that'll do that. I don't know if you're like, I don't know if there's a service that specifically would, I don't know, you can check with, landscaping services or things like that, see if that's something they might do. They might not feel comfortable like just going after that. Yeah. Let's see. What other questions?
Yeah, I had a question. Is anybody using satellite technology to follow the spread of kudzu? I mean, like, have they written an artificial intelligence program that identifies patches and then sees if they're growing, spreading, getting bigger? I mean, I just looked at the satellite picture of the patch up on Route 60 by the Parkway, and it's really distinctive. I mean, it looks different than the surrounding woodlands.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I'm not aware of like any specific AI program that's used to do that. I do know that some researchers use the software program GIS, Geographical Information Systems, which utilizes the satellites and they can compare, in real time, and then go back, what did it look like 3 years ago versus this year, and then they can trace around it, and it'll automatically calculate the area, and so they can see how much it's expanded. That's kind of it's labor intensive, but it's pretty good technology using GIS software. Yeah, but I don't know of like a program that does it more kind of automatically like you're talking about, but that would be really cool. Okay, someone says they're using drones. Susan McLaughlin says they're using drones. Again, there's another technology that, yeah.
Art, can you look back at 741 in the chat?
I don't see anything at 741 in the chat.
Okay. Question, were the bullfrogs found in Utah the same species as the native species in the eastern US?
Yes.
Okay. Is DOT still selling or planting kudzu and selling to nurseries?
That I don't know. And I think the question that Richard brought up is, the Department of Transportation's priorities are probably different than this organization's priorities, and it's possible they're still moving them and planting them around. Kudzu's gotten pretty well known, and so hopefully there's an effort to control it. And that might be a you know, kind of a grassroots cause that organizations like this can raise awareness of, and maybe interface with the Department of Transportation to see if that's on their radar, if that's something they're considering when they go in to make changes or repairs or things like that.
Yeah, it seems like something we should check into. I'm motivated to inquire about that. But another thing I wanted to ask is, should we be concerned about packets of mixed seeds, like flower seeds, that are sold in a mass market, having some species that might not be appropriate for our area, like flower seeds, you know?
What kind of a market? Like just an open farmers market kind of thing?
Well, no, I mean like a seed company that sells mixed flower seeds. And I was in Chicago one time at an event, and the lady was, you know, offering some mixed flower seeds as a, you know, trying to be nice. And I was just concerned that since she was from the West, if you know I planted those in Virginia, that it might not be well adjusted and could, you know, have an invasive in it. I don't know. I'm just.
That's again, that's a good question, and I don't have a good answer for you. What I can say though is that verifying the species of products has become a bigger issue. You know, for example, I know in a lot of seafood restaurants, they've experienced difficulty in obtaining you know, the you know, really expensive species that they want to sell to their customers, and they've actually gone ahead and just started, you know, finding more common species, but just relabeling it and saying, oh, it's this species, whether it be cod or swordfish or whatever, and charging prices for that species when it's actually just this ordinary common species that's easily you know, farmed and nurtured. But scientists, again, and this is just some good, you know, using some good you know, genetic research, where they go in and they take samples in these markets and take them back to the lab and you know, compare them with what they are, and they've actually raised awareness for keeping these companies honest. I've actually, a couple of my friends that I was in grad school with at the University of Georgia, they actually formed a startup company where they're doing just that. They're verifying the species that are in various kind of like herbal medicines that are being sold, so that people know that, okay, they're saying that they're selling me this plant species or this extract from this plant species, and this company is backing up, this independent company is backing up and certifying that yes, they are indeed this species, and it's not just some snake oil that's being sold. And so the technology for doing that is there and it's available. Whether that's being done, I don't know. You might look into those companies and see if they have any kind of like certification on their websites or wording saying that, you know, they've gone through and tested to make sure that you're just getting that species.
Yeah, and if it's in a mix, then that becomes more difficult. And I know this lady had a good intention, so I'm not, but it's one of those things that we're just naive and therefore vulnerable.
Jared, could you give us that database of locations again? EDD, I think it was.
There, I put the link in the chat, www.eddmapps.org. But you can find that in the, and let me just make sure I got that right in there. I'll just switch over here to this and, whoops. Oh, I'm sorry. It should just have one P, not two. Here, let me just copy and paste this in there. There we go. There's the link. That's the correct link there. To that website.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And again, you can go in on that website, and you can search for, you know, specific species and see what it looks like, or what's been found or documented in your area. And there's some, you know, good tools on there for the general public.
Jared, Jim again. In the map you showed, North Carolina and Virginia seem to have less coverage than Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. Is that because those areas are environmentally, they're more favorable for kudzu? I've always found kudzu along the Route 60 route going over to Amherst, and assumed that it was in high elevations. Is that not a good assumption to make?
No, I don't think we are anywhere near the elevation. I mean, this whole area, I mean, there's not many areas that get, you know, too high, I think, really to affect that. There's a number of things that could affect that. I think there's a significant climate difference between, you know, Virginia and Alabama and Georgia, and that might be, you know, humidity, that might be temperature, the amount of moisture, a number of things there that might be affecting it. It just might be that those areas of the country are just a little bit better. It's a little bit better adapted to, and so it thrives better and establishes faster. But I mean, again, if you look at you know, that those pockets in West Virginia, I don't know, that I could be wrong there. Part of it might also be like, you know, how much effort has gone into intentionally planting bees, and that might be a state by state thing. And yeah, it's hard to predict there.
Thank you.
Yeah. That is bad. It is real interesting. One of the things I was wondering about is as the warming trend in our climate, there's a species migration that's kind of necessary for adapting as the environment changes. And the best case scenario, well, I mean, the best case scenario, we would stop the warming, but, you know, assuming that those things are going to happen, to allow the ecology to evolve with the new temperature setting. So are these things affected by kudzu in particular, the temperature?
Well, in general, I mean, temperature is going to affect a whole host of environmental variables that could, you know, make the habitat more suitable for not just kudzu, but other invasive species. And that's one of the things with climate change that, you know, we point to is with climate change, it especially as more northerly latitudes get warmer temperatures, are we going to see this shift in migration and this expansion of more invasive species as more habitat becomes available for them to establish themselves? And so climate change is concerning because the temperature could adjust and modify habitats to make expansion easier for them. And so I think it's certainly a concern with kudzu and a lot of other invasive species as well. It's one of those kind of big things that could really have major impact. And invasive species are one of the concerns with climate change and how that's going to, you know, affect things in the long term.
But to some extent, though, isn't it reasonable that some migration of native species would be appropriate?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, native species would migrate as well, and the question is how well are they going to compete with invasive species? Invasive species are known to be good colonizers uh, because that's required of them to establish themselves, and so invasive species might have a little bit of an edge over native species because they're just better colonizers. That's what they've established them. That's how they establish themselves, and it's how they propagate.
Well, Jared, excellent presentation. I do appreciate it. I do more now than I did when we started. And I just want to thank you a lot for taking your time to inform us. I know it's something you care about, and that's what I appreciate about our presenters. So,
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity, and if anybody has more questions, I'm just going to drop my email address right here in the chat. Feel free to shoot me an email. Always happy to talk with the people in the community and help them understand and just connect with them and just continue this education and raising awareness. So really appreciate everybody that showed up. I think it's exciting. There's a lot of people in the community that are also interested and concerned about some of these conservation issues. So I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
yeah. All right. Well, I guess this will complete our session today, and I think I will get back with you, Jared. Everybody have a good evening. Good night.
Thank you very much.
Good night, everyone.